Good evening, everyone. My name is Rich Bertel. I'm the stand-in, temporary, to-be-replaced candidate for Vice President of the United States for the Libertarian Party of New York petition drive, which is going on now. Started on April 16th, and we've got until May 28th, the final deadline, drop dead date to get our petition in to the New York State Board of Elections to get ourselves on the ballot. Last few weeks, I've been interviewing different actual candidates for president, and I have here tonight Michael Rectenwald, who's going to be who has been running for the nomination. The nomination will occur on May 26th, right, down in D.C. at the National Convention. So the oddity is in New York,
it looks like Rich is having trouble now.
I'm good. Can you hear me okay, Michael Rectenwald?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, at the end of May, we'll have the actual nomination at the National Convention, but because we have to petition in April and May, we have to use these temporary candidates. But I've been interviewing the actual candidates the last few weeks, just so people in New York get a better flavor for who's going to be actually on the ballot, hopefully in New York and then the rest of the states in the United States. So, Michael Rectenwald, tell us a little bit about yourself, why you got in the race, and your identity of as an anarcho-capitalist. So let's start with just personal information, a little bit of why you're in the race and a little background.
Sure. And I apologize for the virtual background here. It's just that I cannot sit up right this minute. I'm not unhealthy, but I just went on an inversion table, and I stayed on it too long, and it put me into a state of dizziness, so I can't sit up here. In any case,
dizziness and politics kind of go together.
Yes. So I don't know if people don't know anything about me. I could say that I was a former professor at NYU. I am a former NYU professor, author of 12 books, frequent contributor to the Mises Institute as a writer and many times as a speaker, and effectively have given talks all over the country on various topics from a libertarian perspective. And I had given many talks for the Mises Caucus at several of their events. And so they asked me to run, and I took up the charge because the platform that they laid out is very similar to it's identical to what I believe is the required approach to attaining liberty in our lifetimes. And that's through decentralization and, local politics, controlling of local politics. So I'm running on the top of the ticket. I want to run on the top of the ticket for the Libertarian Party to represent the program for maximum liberty, which I think is decentralization with the ideal of anarcho-capitalism. And so there's much more I could say about myself, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay, good. Yeah, and on the topic of anarcho-capitalism, maybe we should expand on that a bit. I'm not sure where we're going to get audience-wise, how many people are going to have some experience with the Libertarian Party and libertarian philosophy in general, or how many kind of new people we get. But two parts of that. I guess I'd like to maybe dissect a little bit about capitalism, because I think that's gotten kind of a bad rap, because what we have in the United States has drifted far away from free market capitalism. And what do you see as some of the key benefits of more anarcho-capitalism in terms of the way we do business and conduct ourselves, corporations and people, and how they conduct themselves with transactions, voluntary transactions? What are the big improvements we'd see if we had a true free market capitalist society here in the U.S. versus what we cooked up here the last really it's been going bad since the Constitution was written. We've never really followed the ideal of the Constitution.
Yeah, so what we have right now is crony capitalism, or corporatism, corporatocracy, you name it. It's a system of collusion between the state and various corporate players. And it benefits those particular chosen players and by virtue of handing them monopolies effectively through regulations and other means. I would abolish the corporate laws altogether and get rid of the incorporation. Get rid of incorporation generally, but what would happen would be that you'd have private property society whereby, you know, who knows how much wealth is being extracted by the state in order to support the federal government in particular. Probably a good 50%, if not more, of wealth is being extracted by the federal government. So that wealth would stay among the people. And then voluntary transactions without regulations, without interference, without interventions by the federal government would be an enormous boon to people in terms of wealth and prosperity and in terms of liberty. They would no longer have to be under the thumb of a government that is regulating and controlling and intervening and interloping in everything that they do. So I think that that's why I know that in our lifetimes we'll never reach this goal. So it's an asymptote, a goal that you approach but never quite reach. But I think it has to be the ideal so that we know we're headed in the right direction.
Agreed. Yeah. Folded into the idea of private property and ownership is intellectual property. I mean, what are some of your philosophies and beliefs on intellectual property, and especially in terms of what the state is now doing and should stop doing, and what would be better if it were left to private individuals?
Well, I think the intellectual property regime is an outrage. I think it's terrible. I think intellectual property should be banned as a category of law because what it does is it's a monopoly scheme. It's a limited monopoly scheme that ends up hurting people because, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, patents control and make drugs much more expensive and unattainable for some people altogether. And so you see that they give these limited monopolies to these drug makers, and then they benefit tremendously while people pay through the nose for their drugs or their medications. And so it would increase the availability of medications and things like that without question. And there's other ways to protect creative property than intellectual property law by the state. There are many other means by which you can honor and I should say reward intellectual achievements other than intellectual property law.
How would that work?
Well, for example, let's say I'm an author, so my books are typically covered by copyright. So that means that no other publishers can publish a book that's copyrighted without permission, and that just means that the book gets much less circulation. It gets into less hands, and I think the way you deal with it is you allow reproduction, and people can sell. If they can reproduce a book, they should be able to sell it. The author could actually have agreements with the publisher such that, or with the reader, I should say, that they allow pre-production of their text, but without limiting the availability of that text. I mean, right now I'm not an expert on intellectual property law, but I do have on my board of advisors Stefan Kinsella, who is an absolute master of this stuff, and his work on intellectual property is absolutely vital.
I was fumbling around there looking for something. So there was an article I read like 9 years ago, A Question of Utility from The Economist, which was quite critical of patents. And I think it's a good read for anyone listening in. Do a search for it. The Economist, A Question of Utility is from 2015. But yeah, it emphasizes what you're saying, that the whole patent system was intended to help, small time inventors protect their ideas and the developments. But what you found is it's been exploited by the big businesses. The little guys don't get much benefit from patents. And then there's this whole patent trolling issue now, where it's it's fueling a whole cottage industry of lawsuits, right? So
Right.
yeah, so it just really isn't really even living up to its ideal.
Now, I mean, the thing is, the patent started from, this was they started during the era of monarchs, and this was a special license given to businesses to perform certain tasks or sell certain items. It was a royal patent that was actually handed to these particular chosen monopolists, really, over particular areas of business or selling of particular goods. And so it all this royal imprimatur really, it comes out of the ancient regime and really should have nothing to do with a free market. It shouldn't be, it should not exist in a free market. We're not living under kings and queens now,
Right.
supposedly.
Right. I think besides defense of intellectual property and getting away from patents and state protected property, intellectual property, what about liability? If you eliminated the concept of incorporations, which obviously a key purpose of corporations is to limit or sometimes almost completely avoid liability. What are some free market ideas for liability, where if if a vendor does wrong by a consumer, what are good tools for the consumer to use to be made whole, other than having the overbearing state, or in the case of what's too often now, no liability, where the consumer really has no choice, no ability to get any restitution.
I would say that the primary means is through, through a suit, through a class action suit is probably the best way that consumers can counter or respond to situations in which they were either ripped off or otherwise frauded in some sense. So,
But are you someone that would say? I mean, I guess a phrase I often use is, my personal belief, is that no product or service should have special liability. We have all these carve outs for special liability, and sometimes it's too much, sometimes it's too little. Two keen examples I give is that vaccines have special liability, especially during COVID. The PrEP Act, I think, was extremely bad policy, because it gave a lot of special liability out to these rushed supposed vaccines for treating COVID, and now people don't have any means to seek remedies if they've been harmed by the vaccine, because there certainly does seem to be evidence that these vaccines have caused some injuries. And the flip side of that, in New York State, we have something called the scaffold law, whereas if someone falls in a gravity-related injury on a construction site, there's absolute liability, even if there's contributory negligence. If you're drunk and you issued safety equipment and you don't use it properly, you fall, you get hurt, your employer is fully liable. That you have the employer has no chance at defense. So that's an example of too much liability. And vaccines maybe too little liability.
Yes, with vaccines, they got exemption from liability. which is and a monopoly over the production. It's just an outrage. So, and they also, well, in the case of the COVID vaccine, for example, they use the vaccine and its limited liability or zero liability plus patent status to coerce the public into accepting a vaccine that they didn't want, necessarily. So I think a free and open market competition between different medicines, different approaches to health would improve the situation tremendously.
Any other issues on, business related, the capitalism? How do we make capitalism look good in the eyes of the American public again? What other hot buttons you think Americans are caught up on? Liability, regulations, monopolies. What are some other buzzwords that you think of when you've been campaigning, when someone's criticizing the idea of anarcho capitalism? What else do you hear on the capitalism component that people
well, not
about?
from libertarians, you don't hear too much complaints about capitalism per se.
Right.
But if I were talking to a leftist, for example, or a Marxist, I would demolish their idea, the premises under which they're operating, which is the idea that there's exploitation at the point of production, and the worker is necessarily ripped off at the point of production through exploitation, the skimming off of surplus value by the capitalist class. This is completely ridiculous, and it all hinges on the labor theory of value, which is false, because value is subjective, and it's not dependent on how much labor inputs are embedded in a particular good or commodity. So I would attack it that way and show them how once the labor theory of value falls, then the whole theory of exploitation and the poo-pooing of capitalism is really ridiculous. And the whole progressive position really hinges on this assumption that somehow the working class is being ripped off every day by the capitalist class. And this all goes back to an often unstated premise of Marxism. It's a stated premise within Marxism, but people are often unconscious Marxists who have absorbed this premise without examination. And they think that there is definitely some sort of unscrupulous activity happening on the part of the capitalist who hires a worker, and that the worker is necessarily being screwed, cheated, robbed on a daily basis, on an hour-by-hour basis, on a minute-by-minute basis, when in fact there's a contract between the worker and the it's a voluntary relationship. It's a voluntary association, and there's no theft going on. That's based on the labor theory of value, that the value of a good is the amount of labor time embedded in a good. That's just absolutely untrue. Once you knock down that premise, then this whole idea that capitalism is some sort of an exploitative system falls with it, and therefore so does a lot of the redistributionist schemes that are actually premised on this idea. I mean, why else would we redistribute wealth unless we thought somebody was being robbed by the productive owners of capital?
Yeah, there's a lot of envy in the whole scheme. Yeah, another criticism of socialism, I think, you have to lay on the man is inherently flawed. We're not perfect beings, and big flaw of socialism is that ambition doesn't thrive unless you have competition to perform.
Right.
Like the Mayflower experiment, when Americans first, was 1600s, that Mayflower experiment with the Pilgrims, they attempted the first winter, a socialist experiment, and it flopped because people didn't want to produce and share all their labor with everybody else. Everybody kind of coasted a bit. and they almost all starved. So,
Yes,
and then when
that's right.
they get divvied out private property rights, productivity launched forward because people had more incentive, because a lot of their efforts in production benefited themselves more so than just helping the collective. So that's
Yes,
kind of the nature of man, is that we're gonna just, if we're not under some pressure to perform, the tendency of man is just to become lazy. Let's be blunt about it. So
yes.
yeah.
And there's the unspoken premise there is that there's some bounty and that already pre-exists our activity, and all that we need to do is distribute it properly. When in fact, the truth underlying economic activity is that scarcity is a precondition of all economic activity, and it doesn't acknowledge scarcity as a reality. That's the starting point for all human beings, is scarcity. So production has to happen. Without production, we live in scarcity, and and then in order to motivate production, of course you need competition. Indeed.
Yep. Well, I think we covered business and capitalism and those topics pretty thoroughly. How about some? You want to share a few of your thoughts on foreign policy? How would you like to see us move foreign policy? And then, in terms of, the ideal world, right, is no nations, no borders. I mean, the asymptote that you talk about reaching is, I mean,
Well, there would be private property boundaries, of course. Yeah. So you'd have borders around your property. That would be the key distinction. But I would say, in terms of foreign policy, absolute non-interventionism, complete, cutting of all foreign aid, especially military and aid and military arms to other nations. Right now, we're involved in 2 proxy wars, and maybe 3 if you count Taiwan. And this is imperiling first of all, it's robbing us to pay for these wars, and it's escalating the possibility of a real major world war at this juncture, both in Ukraine and coming out of the Israel Gaza Strip conflict. So I'd say pull all troops out of all bases, from all 800 plus bases around the world. No more foreign aid, no more military interventionism. The idea would be that, look, our relationship should be based on peace and trade.
Wouldn't you say that the proxy wars aren't really to support anybody except Raytheon and Lockheed and Halliburton? They're the ones
That's
who
right.
profit. And then they feed the
Yeah,
money back to the politicians.
that's exactly what happens. So the wars are not even meant to be won, as we know. As Julian Assange pointed out, this is just a funnel to drain taxpayer money into the coffers of these military and industrial complex producers.
and then the border crisis. What are your thoughts on what to do in the short term, and what's the best long term solution for borders in the United States and then other countries as well?
Can you repeat that one?
Oh, for borders, I mean, what would you consider a good thing to do in the short term with the border problem in the United States? And then again,
Oh,
what's the ideal? What would be your
okay.
ideals?
Yes. Okay. In the short term, first of all, the border crisis is a crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis caused by government in general. So many factors have led into it. First of all, of course, the foreign interventionism of the United States, which has displaced people all over the world. That has to end. And then number 2, the war on drugs, which has created the cartels and the black market that they service, and that has to end. And then third, trade sanctions and restrictions, both tariffs and also just embargoes, all that has to end. this, and then fourth, the artificial incentivizing of immigration through social welfare handouts to incoming immigrants. This has to end. All of these things together, if eliminated, would ease the pressure on the border dramatically. And then you could institute a rational immigration policy based on an invitation system. That is, immigrants are invited to come to the country by companies, by individuals, and who take out a liability insurance for them for their economic liability, and then you get rid of labor laws that forbid them from working, and you'll have actually a very liberal system. It's not like some sort of draconian closed border system. It's just it's an invitation-based system that would probably bring in more immigrants, but then would have them would have their the inviters that they would assume liability, economic liability, commercial liability for these immigrants, and there would be no social welfare payouts at all. That's the way to solve it. Eventually, of course, in a fully private property society, the only borders that would exist would be the borders around your property. And in order to go onto somebody's property, you have to be invited.
Right, right. Much less public property. Ideally, zero, right? That's the ideal, is to have none.
Zero.
Well, in the current scheme, work visa quotas and visa expiration dates, would you agree? I feel they're both counterproductive. Would you agree with me on that they're really counterproductive concepts?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. They should be eliminated.
Right.
They're very counterproductive. So getting rid of visa schemes, expiring visas, and all that, it should be privatized. I say move towards privatization as soon and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I haven't checked the numbers in a few years. I mean, of course, with what's gone on here of late, it's we've got a lot of asylum seekers. Really, is what the problem is now. But if you go back 8 to 10 years, roughly half of the undocumented or illegal immigrants were people who had their work visa expired. So we shot ourselves in the foot.
Yes,
putting
exactly.
An expiration date on the work visas, and then they would end up being underground, and yeah, that was a big problem.
Yeah, that's a problem, and it's easily solved by getting rid of the whole work visa status and just putting it into private hands.
Private hands, invitation. When you're here, you're working. When you're here, the employer that brings you in is responsible for you. Yeah, I mean, it seems like an easy system. Get the government out of it.
Yes, get the government out of it, and then privatize as much land as possible, of course. We want total privatization. I think that's another thing that could be done, is privatize the property around borders. And then, of course, all public property in general.
I forget, what state do you currently reside in, or where have you lived in your life?
Where have I lived in my life?
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. It's going to be a long list.
Yeah, okay. Just what I was getting at is east of the Mississippi, west of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, like almost 50%, there's 44, 47%, something like that of the land is federally owned. Right.
Yeah, outrageous.
Mississippi. Yeah, and east of the Mississippi, it's like a tenth of that. It's only like 4 or 5% that's
right.
That's owned by the government. So yeah, I mean, we're the east of the Mississippi, the East Coast, it's quite heavily privatized already. We don't have too much further to go, but in the West, yeah, the government still owns huge amounts of land,
which is
get
really
that in
ridiculous.
Private hands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the taxpayers that have been paying taxes on land should be able to be the owners of that land, and that goes for public squares or whatever. This should all become joint stock property, probably.
Good. Let's see. We covered war, borders. You mentioned the war on drugs earlier. You're saying how counterproductive that is with the border crisis, right? So we should get rid of the war on drugs. What are some other key issues that when you've been stomping the country here, what are some of your key issues that you bring up. Maybe more so, more so than other candidates, perhaps.
Well, I think I'm the only candidate that's running openly as an anarcho-capitalist. Everybody else is talking about limited government and constitutional, getting back to the constitutional setup. I just don't think that's possible, and I don't think obviously that didn't work the first time. So I don't know why people would expect it to work now. So I'd say that's the biggest one. And then decentralization is a big part of my campaign program. And that is wresting power away from the federal government and vesting it at the local level, in people at the local level. Nullification is, of course, a big part of decentralization. To nullify unconstitutional laws and mandates at the local level. And it's very important. Decentralization is very important because at this juncture in history, and I talk about some of these things that no other candidate addresses, is that there is a globalist push to incorporate the UN's Agenda 2030 items into local government and of course national. And that has to be resisted at some point. And the place to resist it is at the local level. This is going to involve all kinds of restrictions on consumption, mobility, you name it, all through the local level where they're already instituting in many townships around the country Agenda 2030 items such as elimination of driving at certain times. This is already, they're not instituting it yet, but it's already on the agendas. Limiting mobility with gasoline powered cars, getting rid of lawnmowers that use gasoline. In New York City, they just got rid of, they're getting rid of ovens that burn wood.
Yeah, I mean, there's an anti-natural gas agenda all throughout New York State. I mean,
Right.
They don't want new houses to be built that use natural gas, which we're a cold climate here. I don't know how we're going to manage getting through winter if nobody can use natural gas or oil or coal.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's
unbelievable.
Crazy. Yep.
It's just unbelievable. So those items, that Agenda 2030, that's real. This climate catastrophism nonsense that they're shoving down our throats, that is a real threat to liberty, and no other candidate addresses this at all. They look at me like I'm talking some crazy conspiracy theory stuff, and they've even said that. One of the candidates said that's conspiracy theory. No, it's not.
Yeah, I mean I know I've had that conversation 10 years ago. It's like the Agenda 2030 is a published policy. It's hundreds of pages long. It's not a conspiracy. It's a published document.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's being uptake. Of course they have to get it into legislation, but that's underway. And then under the Biden administration, it's gotten into, executive orders. He's issued some, I think, 12 to 14 EOs based on this climate catastrophism, and they're going to start calling it the climate crisis now. And there's recently, just 2 days ago, or was it yesterday, that there's news that Biden could declare a climate emergency, which would give him emergency powers akin to a president during wartime. And that could cause a major lockdowns. It could come with lockdowns. It could come with mobility restrictions, driving, all this. This is all real.
Yep. And one thing that's going on in New York is, and I'm sure other states, is you see some contradictory silliness with regarding zoning laws, because we've got the state government on the one hand trying to upzone and require local governments to enable multifamily housing where there are single family homes to
Right.
try to stimulate more construction and reduce housing costs. But the other hand, there's a town an hour from me that's unzoned, completely unzoned, and the government doesn't like that. They want them to implement zoning. It's like, and this is a small town where the only zoning they would have would be single family homes. So it's like,
Right.
on the one hand, you're writing a policy that we don't want to have exclusive single family home zoning, but oh, here's a town that's unzoned. We want you to implement zoning. Oh, okay, it's going to be all single family homes. Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
guess
that's so
it's all
they
right.
could. That's probably so they could then change the zoning. They want to get them on the map of zoning so that they can then say, well, you can't zone it this way. You need to allow for multifamily dwellings.
Right, which is allowed now because there's no zoning at all. So you could,
Right.
people could build what they want. So
Right.
it's like it doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's people can look up on Facebook. It's called Caroline Residents Against Zoning. It's a town in Tompkins County, New York, about an hour from me here. But yeah,
Wow.
it's kind of laughable. It's you see the state giving incentives to counties to make sure that all their small towns and villages are zoned, but then at the same time saying, zoning has its problems, especially single family zoning. We want to, supersede that at the state level. And again, the small towns, if you zone them, what's going to happen? It's going to be almost all single family home zoning.
Right.
Just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
But I think it's just trying to it's just the government trying to get control over things.
It's what it comes down to is, they want that central power and control.
Yeah.
What's really best for the people is often secondary or
Yes.
or tertiary or further down the list in nature.
The state has its own desiderata, and one of the major desiderata of the state is expansion and increased power. That's what it has it has a tendency to try to increase its reach, power, penetration, and scope.
Next topic is pretty easy one, I think, low hanging fruit. So you're running for president of the United States. That would be a federal office, and you've talked about decentralization, less power to the federal government. I mean, public education, no brainer. The federal government never should have got involved. You could probably axe the federal Department of Education pretty easily if you were president, right?
Yes,
that'd be like one of the low hanging fruit to get rid of, right?
Department of Education would go immediately, and that would allow localized school control and education. And then, I think mandatory schooling, compulsory education, 1 through 12 and all that, I think that should be stricken. Why should the government tell you how long you need to go to school? Who are they to tell you how long you need to go to school? That's ridiculous. So, and it's for many people, depending on the school district and their attitudes towards school and their talents, their aptitudes for it, it's a prison sentence.
Agreed.
So I would say compulsory education is wrong. It's actually it's coercive, and in many cases, it's very counterproductive. You've got people that don't have that. Pardon?
I say the one size fits all thing doesn't work. It stifles creativity, and it just makes the kids into little robots for the state.
Either robots or hooligans because they want to rebel against this restriction. I don't blame them in a way. Many of them have different talents, different aptitudes. It should be, you should be allowed to take up as much schooling or as little schooling as you want. And I don't see why, people can't work from the age of some competency. I don't understand why, this comes out of the 19th century and the labor laws against, child labor and the so-called exploitation of children by their families. I don't think that we have an economy that really would do that because it's not necessary now. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, there was a transition there was a very difficult transition that took place for laborers, and we're well past that, so there's no need to worry about that anymore.
Well, at that time, children worked because the family needed the money.
Right.
It wasn't because the parents were exploiting their kids, but
right.
That could make the difference between paying the rent and getting thrown out on the street,
Right, exactly. Right.
I grew up on a dairy farm, so yeah, so kids were expected to start helping with chores at a very young age, and I don't feel like I was exploited by my parents or
Yeah.
anything. It just kind of we all, it definitely helps you build character, and you learn a lot, from
Yeah.
working like that. So
Same here.
yeah,
I worked. My father was owned a small construction firm, and I worked in the summers from age 9 on, and on weekends when it was needed. So, and I learned how to have discipline and work habits, and that's paid off great dividends for me as far as even it totally applied to a totally different area, academia, scholarship. You just learn how to be, learn how to have discipline and have work habits that work for you in the future. So that didn't hurt me at all. I
Well, you
didn't have.
learn that 8 a.m. is the time you start work, not when you decide to wander in. Well,
It was whenever I had to pack, load up the truck with tools and supplies that we needed for the job. That's when it started, which was usually about 8 o'clock. Yeah.
what are some other departments in the federal government that you'd like to take a whack to right away besides the Department of Education? What do you
Well,
think could go quickly?
the whole IC, the whole intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI,
All the spy networks.
all the networks that are nothing but repressive and oppressive state apparatuses that do nothing for us.
TSA.
TSA, ATF.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
There's
TSA.
so many. There are so many agencies in the intelligence community. I can't name them all. I think there's 36, I believe, something like that. There's 36 spy agencies, effectively.
And Congress keeps renewing their ability to spy on us without warrants and
Right.
without just cause, just routine spying.
Right.
Yep.
It's ridiculous. I'm sorry. I want to apologize again for my posture here tonight, but I still
okay.
feel dizzy, or I would get up and go over to the my studio here. But
Well, you've been lucid and able to have a conversation. That's the important thing. So
okay.
hopefully you feel better soon. And we're coming up on 43 minutes. So I'd like to maybe a few closing thoughts for the next few minutes. Michael Redmond, I kind of was surprised. I wasn't sure you were going to sit in, but so Michael Redmond's with the Mises Caucus here in New York.
Yep.
So he kind of helped facilitate this
I know him.
meeting.
I know him well.
So did you have any pointed questions for Michael Rectenwald?
I would just, how would you differentiate yourself from the other candidates in a way that would make people want to vote for you, for the delegates to pick you?
I'm the candidate with the boldest messaging that will get the most attention in the public square in the general election. The other candidates, no offense, and I don't mean to personally, I like them all. We're friends, all of them. But a lot of it is just milk toast, like limited government type rhetoric that it doesn't excite anybody. It doesn't excite me, and I know it doesn't excite anybody else. I think we need to have the boldest messaging possible, and that means we're talking about, we're talking in Javier Milei terms, afuera. It's about, taking a wrecking ball to the state, not some sort of surgical policy procedural approach. We need to be dramatic here. We're dealing with a state that is overwhelmingly out of control. It's a behemoth of magnanimous proportions. It is the largest state in the history of humanity, I believe.
How do you see the National Libertarian Party helping with this effort? What do you think their role is?
Well, they have, I think they have been pretty clearly supportive without saying anything about this kind of approach. They have said it I was just in an X space where Angela McArdle was talking, getting interviewed by the Christian Caucus, and she said the Libertarian Party needs to be radical. It's got to be bold and radical. It cannot be, a reformist type party. Now I know that Hornberger says that he's the only non-reformist in the race, but as it turns out, he is a reformist because he's talking about a minarchy, and I mean, minarchy is not, the limited government approach is not radical. It's just kind of, it's reformist as well. So I think
Well, in my opinion, he shot himself in the foot when he advocated opening the whole border and then worrying about the war on drugs and welfare and everything else after the fact. He just had it completely backwards.
Yeah, he has it backwards, and I pushed him on one issue where he said, he wants to cut all social welfare programs tomorrow. I said, fine, and I have a caveat about Social Security, but then when it came to social welfare for incoming immigrants, he said, quote, "We can afford that." So I say, do you hate Americans or what? What is the point here? What is your particular animus toward citizens or, permanent residents of the United States that you want to cut all their benefits, so-called, but you want to keep in place social welfare payouts to immigrants? It's just outrageous.
Yeah, it kind of creates a conflict of interest. But yeah, I think the trade restrictions and the war on drugs are two biggies. And as you say, people from more distant areas. Fortunately, we're not bombing Mexico yet.
Right.
but yet, how many coming from Mexico are actually, as you say, people displaced from our imperialist policies over in the Middle East? They find a way. They're coming through the Mexican border, but they're not Mexicans. They're people that have been screwed up. Their lives have been screwed up by our imperialist policies over in Europe and the Middle East. So
absolutely, that's exactly right, and that's why I say that. Now that that the damages done by our interventionism will take probably decades to settle out. If we were to stop finally, but stopping it now is the beginning of getting this straight, getting this right. So you're not displacing more and more people.
Right.
And of course, as I said, the war on drugs. And then, of course, you can't incentivize this through social welfare payouts. That's just ridiculous. That's a recipe for total disaster, especially if you want total open borders and social welfare to immigrants. You might as well just basically open your door to your house and walk out and live on the street. That's basically what'll happen. It's a violation of property rights.
Yeah.
One more quick question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Given all the damage that's been done so far, do you think it's actually possible to reverse the government actions and fix the economy? Or do we need a major event like another giant stock market crash or something to trigger it?
Well, I'm not an accelerationist. I don't believe in making matters worse before they get better.
Well, I'm not saying making them worse, but
necessarily that they have to get worse to get better. Yeah. But I do believe that no. What I think is, as long as we're alive, kicking in, we have these ideas and we have these principles. There's hope, and we can do something. Yeah. If I didn't think there was hope, I would give up, and I'm not giving up.
All right, that's very good, guys. Any closing thoughts, either one of you?
Well, I'd just like to ask people to get behind this campaign. This is the boldest, the most strident campaign in the LP, and our slogan is "Wreck the Regime." And speaking of the slogan, which you can see there behind me, go to my website, wrecktheregime.com, get involved, And if you can't contribute, we just have a little bit more expenses to get under our belt to handle the convention. But yeah, but we'll ride into the general election with some momentum. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a bunch, gentlemen. And again, this is Rich Pertel, temporary stand-in, to be replaced candidate for vice president in New York. I'll be replaced if we get on the ballot. We got to get those signatures, folks. We need 45,000 signatures by May 28th. We've got candidates like Michael here coming into New York to help us over the next few weeks. We hope we can get all those numbers. But yeah, if you're listening and you want to help, you know, I've collected a couple hundred myself, but to get to 60,000, we need a good 200, 300, 400, 500 volunteers, each getting 100 signatures. So, you know, I've run for local office and collected as many as 500 in 1 year. When you start to get over 200 or 300, if you got a full-time job and other responsibilities, getting more than 200 or 300 gets to be a drag, because then you're talking about, you're talking about spending 5-10 hours a week for 5 weeks, and it's hard for people to squeeze that much time in. So if we had 500 people each getting 100 signatures over 5 weeks, 20 signatures a week, that's not too bad.
It's not too bad.
Yeah, we need to get more volunteers doing a modest amount of work. We can't have 500 people getting 2 signatures. 500 people getting 100 or 50, great.
I'm going to be bringing a team up to New York, so I'm just not coming by myself. I'm bringing a team.
Yeah, great. We really appreciate it. So yeah, we need all the help we can get, and we need it soon. We got to keep those numbers coming in. And so when we get to the midway point, we don't look like we have a big mountain still ahead of us. So thanks so much, gentlemen. I'll end the stream now if you want to stay on for another minute.